Along the western edge of South America, where the continent meets the vast Pacific Ocean, there stretches a ribbon of desert unlike any other place on Earth. This is the coastal plain of northern Peru, a landscape of extraordinary contradictions, where some of the driest sands imaginable lie within sight of one of the richest oceans in the world. The Humboldt Current sweeps northward along this shore, carrying cold Antarctic waters that teem with anchovies and sardines, nourishing seabirds by the millions and creating one of the most abundant marine ecosystems anywhere beneath the waves. Yet the same current that brings such oceanic wealth also steals moisture from the winds, preventing clouds from releasing their rain across the coastal desert that stretches for hundreds of miles. This landscape appears inhospitable at first glance, a realm where months and sometimes years pass without a single drop of rain falling upon the grey and tan sands. The hills rise barren and stark, their slopes carved by ancient water that no longer flows except in the most catastrophic of years when El Niño brings devastating floods. Between these lifeless hills, however, rivers descend from the distant Andes, cutting green valleys through the desert like emerald threads across brown cloth. These rivers carry snowmelt from mountains that tower more than 20,000 feet above the sea, and wherever their waters reach, life explodes in defiant abundance against the surrounding aridity. It was in these river valleys, in this place where desert and fertility existed side by side in the sharpest possible contrast, that one of the America's most remarkable civilizations would eventually rise. But that story begins not with the Chimu themselves, but with the people who came before, who learned the secrets of survival in this unforgiving environment and built the foundation upon which later kingdoms would stand. The roots of the Kingdom of Gold stretch back more than 1,000 years before Chan Chan rose from the sands, back to a time when the first complex societies began to emerge along this desert coast. The earliest peoples who settled these valleys were farmers and fishermen who understood that survival required harnessing both the land and the sea. They cultivated cotton and gourds, beans and squash, learning which crops could thrive in the river valleys and how to coax harvests from the desert soil when supplied with water. They wove nets and fashioned hooks, venturing onto the Pacific in reed boats to harvest the ocean's bounty. They built modest villages near the river mouths where fresh water and marine resources came together, and they began the slow process of transforming the landscape to suit human needs. Over centuries, these early communities grew more sophisticated in their techniques and more ambitious in their vision. They constructed irrigation canals to extend cultivated land beyond the natural reach of the rivers, channeling water across the desert to fields that would otherwise have remained barren. They developed increasingly complex social structures, with some individuals specializing in craft production, while others organized labor and coordinated the agricultural calendar. They built ceremonial centers and began to create the distinctive artistic traditions that would characterize this coast for millennia to come. By around 2,000 years ago, a culture known to archaeologists as the Moche had emerged as the dominant force across several valleys of the northern coast. The Moche were master craftspeople who created ceramics of stunning realism and sophistication, vessels that portrayed the human face with such skill that individual portraits seemed to capture actual people who lived and died 2 millennia past. They were also builders on an impressive scale, constructing massive pyramids from millions of adobe bricks, great mounds that rose above the valley floors as monuments to their gods and their rulers. The Moche understood the environment they inhabited with intimate precision. They expanded irrigation systems to unprecedented scales, engineering canals that ran for miles and required sophisticated understanding of gradients and water flow. They developed agricultural techniques adapted to the challenges of desert farming, including the use of guano from offshore islands as fertilizer, a practice that would continue for centuries. They organized labor on a massive scale, coordinating the work of thousands to build their monuments and maintain their infrastructure. Their society was hierarchical and complex, with powerful lords who commanded the labor of commoners and presided over elaborate ceremonies. The archaeological record preserves evidence of their rituals in stunning detail: sacrificial victims carefully arranged, offerings of precious objects buried with the dead, elaborate costumes worn by priests and warriors. The Moche created some of the most remarkable metalwork ever produced in the ancient Americas, fashioning gold and silver into masks and ornaments of breathtaking artistry. Their lords were buried in tombs filled with treasures that rival anything found in the Old World, surrounded by retainers who followed them into death. For centuries, Moche civilization flourished across the northern valleys, but nothing lasts forever in human affairs. Beginning around the 6th century of the Common Era, the Moche world began to fracture and decline. The reasons for this collapse remain debated among scholars, but the evidence points to a combination of environmental catastrophe and social upheaval. Archaeological excavations have revealed thick layers of sand that buried agricultural fields, suggesting powerful El Niño events brought devastating floods followed by drought. Some sites show evidence of earthquake damage, reminding us that this is a land where the earth itself can shift violently without warning. As environmental challenges mounted, Moche society appears to have fragmented politically. The artistic style that once unified the culture split into regional variants. Construction of major monuments ceased or slowed dramatically. Some valleys were abandoned while others saw populations contract around defensible locations, suggesting warfare became more common. The elaborate burial practices that characterized earlier Moche tombs gave way to simpler interments with fewer grave goods. By around 750 CE, the classical Moche civilization had effectively come to an end, though its cultural legacy would continue to influence the peoples of the coast. The period that followed is known to scholars as the Middle Horizon, a time of transition and transformation across the Andes. Into the vacuum left by Moche decline, new cultural influences spread from the highlands. The Wari Empire, centered in the south-central Andes near modern Ayacucho, extended its influence across much of Peru during this era. Wari architectural styles, ceramic designs, and perhaps administrative practices reached some of the northern coastal valleys, though the nature and extent of highland control over the coast remains a subject of scholarly discussion. On the north coast itself, regional cultures emerged in the various valleys, each maintaining some elements of Moche tradition while developing distinctive local characteristics. The Lambayeque culture flourished in the valleys to the north, creating their own impressive monuments and continuing the coastal tradition of fine metalwork. In the Moche Valley itself, the valley that would later become the heartland of the Chimu Kingdom, populations regrouped and adapted to new circumstances. The great Moche pyramids remained as testament to past glory, but new centers began to emerge as people reorganized themselves in the changed landscape. During these transitional centuries, the fundamental techniques and knowledge that made civilization possible on the desert coast were preserved and refined. Irrigation agriculture continued, perhaps with innovations in water management that would later be expanded. Craft traditions persisted, with metallurgists and weavers passing their skills to new generations. The ocean continued to provide its abundance, and fishing communities maintained their ancient relationship with the sea. The physical infrastructure of canals and fields, though perhaps partially abandoned or damaged, remained in the landscape as both resource and inspiration for those who would come after. By around 900 CE, the Wari Empire had collapsed, and its highland influence over the coast had waned. The Middle Horizon gave way to what scholars call the Late Intermediate Period, an era when regional kingdoms emerged across the Andes, each developing distinctive cultural identities while competing for resources and power. It was during this period, in these centuries after the fall of the Moche and the withdrawal of highland powers, that a new civilization began to coalesce in the valleys of the northern coast. The people who would become known as the Chimu began to distinguish themselves in the Moche Valley during the 10th century. They were heirs to a long coastal tradition, descendants of populations that had lived in these valleys for millennia, and had survived the challenges that brought down earlier civilizations. They inherited the agricultural knowledge developed over centuries of desert farming. They possessed the metallurgical skills that had made the coast famous. They understood the engineering principles necessary to manage water in an arid environment. Most importantly, they were ready to build something new from the foundation of the past. The name Chimu itself comes from later times, a word that appears in Spanish colonial documents but may not have been what the people called themselves. Some evidence suggests they referred to their kingdom as Chimor, though even this is uncertain. What is clear is that this culture began to emerge as a distinct entity during the 10th century, marked by specific pottery styles, architectural forms, and social organization that differentiated them from their neighbors and linked them back to the Moche heritage while pointing forward to something unprecedented in scale. The environment they inhabited remained as challenging as ever. The desert gave nothing without effort. Every field under cultivation existed only because human hands had directed water to it through carefully maintained canals. Every harvest depended on the rivers continuing to flow from the Andes, on the timing of planting and irrigation being calculated with precision, on the labor being organized efficiently. Failure could mean famine. Success required not just hard work, but sophisticated coordination and planning. Yet this very harshness also offered opportunities. The desert provided natural boundaries and defenses. The concentration of population and resources in the river valleys made administration more manageable than it might have been in more dispersed settlement patterns. The necessity of organized irrigation created natural hierarchies and administrative structures. The abundance of the sea provided protein that supplemented agricultural production. The lack of rain meant that adobe architecture, built from sun-dried mud bricks, could last for centuries without deteriorating, allowing for the construction of monumental buildings with relatively simple materials and techniques. As the 10th century progressed into the 11th, the nascent Chimu state began to expand and consolidate its power. They built upon ruins and memories of the Moche, incorporating elements of that earlier culture's grandeur into their own developing identity. They recognized that the key to power on this coast lay in controlling water, controlling labor, and controlling the trade routes that connected valleys with each other and the coast with the highlands. They understood that monumental architecture served not just practical purposes but symbolic ones, demonstrating power and organizing society through the physical landscape itself. In the Moche Valley, at a site not far from the ancient Moche pyramids, they began to build a new capital that would eventually dwarf anything the coast had seen before. This city, which the Spanish would later call Chan Chan, would grow to become the largest adobe city ever constructed, a sprawling urban complex covering more than 6 square miles. But in its earliest phases it was still modest, just the first of the great compounds that would eventually number 10, the beginning of an architectural vision that would take centuries to fully realize. The founding of Chan Chan marked the true beginning of the Chimu Kingdom, the moment when a regional culture transformed into an imperial power. The people who built those first adobe walls were creating something that would last for half a millennium, a civilization that would come to dominate the entire northern coast of Peru. They could not have known that their kingdom would eventually control a territory stretching 1,000 miles along the coast, that their artisans would create works of art that would amaze the world, that their engineering achievements would rival those of any ancient civilization. They knew only that they were building something new in an ancient land, raising walls in the desert, channeling water across the sand, and dreaming of gold. The city that rose from the sands of the Moche Valley represented more than just an accumulation of buildings and people. Chan Chan embodied a particular vision of how power should be organized, displayed, and perpetuated across generations. Unlike many ancient cities that grew organically over time, spreading haphazardly as population increased and needs changed, Chan Chan was conceived according to a deliberate architectural philosophy that would guide its development for centuries. At its heart were structures that the Spanish would later call ciudadelas, great walled compounds that served as palaces, administrative centers, burial monuments, and symbols of royal authority all at once. The first of these ciudadelas was constructed sometime in the late 10th or early 11th century, establishing the template that later rulers would follow with variations. These were not modest structures, but massive rectangular enclosures, each covering several acres and surrounded by towering adobe walls that could reach heights of 30 feet or more. The walls themselves made statements about power and resources built from millions of adobe bricks that required enormous amounts of labor to manufacture, transport, and assemble. Each brick was formed by hand from mud mixed with water and straw, then dried in the sun until hard enough to stack. The quantities involved were staggering, representing millions of person-hours of work organized and directed toward a single purpose. The exterior walls of a ciudadela presented a largely blank face to the world, tall and imposing with few openings to reveal what lay within. This architecture of concealment and exclusion was deliberate, separating those with access from those without, creating layers of privilege that corresponded to social hierarchy. A single entrance, usually on the northern side of the compound, provided the only way in or out. This entrance was designed to be controlled and defensible, a narrow passage that could be easily monitored and where visitors could be screened before being allowed to proceed deeper into the compound. Once inside, the layout revealed itself as a carefully planned progression of spaces, each more restricted than the last. The first courtyards were relatively open and could accommodate larger numbers of people, perhaps for public ceremonies or administrative functions where the ruler might appear before assembled nobles and officials. These spaces featured platforms and ramps that elevated certain areas above others, creating stages for ritual and governance. The walls throughout were decorated with elaborate friezes, patterns molded into the adobe that repeated geometric designs or stylized representations of marine life, particularly fish and seabirds that reflected the coastal environment and perhaps held religious significance. Moving deeper into a ciudadela meant passing through more doorways and traversing more courtyards, each passage marking a transition to more exclusive space. The architecture itself enforced social hierarchy, with physical barriers requiring permission to cross. Storage rooms and workshops occupied some areas, filled with goods and staffed by artisans who worked directly for the royal household. Audiencias, or audience chambers, featured high-backed seats where officials or the ruler himself might have received visitors, conducted business, or presided over ceremonies. These distinctive U-shaped structures would become one of the most recognizable features of Chimu architecture, appearing in ciudadelas throughout the kingdom's history. At the very heart of each compound lay the most restricted areas, including the private quarters of the ruler, and eventually his burial platform. This platform was a solid mass of adobe, sometimes rising 20 feet or more above the surrounding ground, beneath which elaborate tombs would be constructed. When a Chimu ruler died, he was interred in this platform within his own ciudadela, surrounded by treasures, accompanied by sacrificial victims, sealed away in darkness. The compound then became his eternal residence, maintained by retainers and family members who continued to administer the lands and resources attached to it. This system of split inheritance, where each new ruler built his own palace compound rather than occupying his predecessors, had profound implications for the city's development and the kingdom's political structure. Each king needed to establish his own economic base, his own lands and resources separate from those controlled by the mummy bundles of his ancestors. This created constant pressure for expansion, as new rulers required new sources of wealth to build and maintain their compounds and to support their courts. The system drove military conquest and territorial expansion, pushing the boundaries of Chimu control ever outward along the coast. The early rulers of Chan Chan, whose names have been lost to time or survive only as fragments in later traditions, began the process of consolidating control over the Moche Valley itself and the adjacent valleys to the north and south. The Chicama Valley to the north was agriculturally rich and strategically important. The Viru Valley to the south offered additional resources and controlled routes leading to more distant territories. Bringing these valleys under Chimu authority required both military force and diplomatic skill, as well as the administrative capacity to integrate new territories into the kingdom's structures. Military conquest along the coast had its own particular character, shaped by the environment and the settlement patterns. The population was concentrated in the river valleys, separated by stretches of empty desert that could be crossed but not easily defended. Controlling a valley meant controlling its irrigation system, the canals that were the lifelines of agriculture and settlement. An invading force could threaten to destroy canals or divert water, bringing a population to its knees without necessarily fighting major battles. Defense required protecting not just fortified positions, but the dispersed infrastructure of water management spread across miles of territory. The Chimu developed military capabilities appropriate to this kind of warfare. They maintained forces capable of sustained campaigns, supplied by the agricultural surplus their irrigation agriculture produced. They built fortifications at strategic locations, particularly at valley necks where canals could be controlled and approaches monitored. They demonstrated the ability to coordinate operations across multiple valleys, suggesting well-developed systems of communication and command. Coastal navigation allowed them to move forces by sea as well as by land, giving them flexibility that purely land-based powers lacked. As each valley fell under Chimu control, it was integrated into an expanding administrative system. Local rulers might be left in place as subordinate lords, required to send tribute to Chan Chan and provide labor when called upon, but allowed to maintain authority over their immediate territories. In other cases, Chimu governors or administrators might be installed directly, particularly in areas of strategic importance, or where local resistance made indirect rule impractical. The kingdom was becoming a true state, with bureaucratic structures that allowed the center to extract resources from the periphery and coordinate activities across an expanding territory. Back in Chan Chan itself, the city was growing beyond just the royal compounds. Surrounding the ciudadelas, neighborhoods of smaller structures housed the thousands of people whose labor sustained the kingdom. Artisans worked in specialized workshops, producing the ceramics, textiles, metalwork, and other goods that the elite demanded and that served as markers of status and power. Potters shaped vessels from local clay, creating the characteristic blackware that would become associated with Chimu culture, burnished to a shine and often decorated with molded designs rather than painted ones. Weavers worked looms, creating textiles from cotton and wool, some plain and utilitarian, others elaborate and richly decorated. The metalworkers, however, occupied a special place in this urban landscape. Gold and silver had long been precious on the coast, not just for their rarity, but for their symbolic associations with the sun and moon, with divine forces that ruled over human affairs. The Chimu metalworkers were heirs to the Moche tradition of sophisticated metallurgy, and they would eventually surpass their predecessors in both technical skill and productive output. Their workshops in Chan Chan processed raw metals that arrived as tribute from conquered territories or as trade goods from the highlands and the far north where gold was more readily available. The city required massive amounts of water, not just for the human population, but for the agriculture in surrounding fields that fed that population. The Chimu engineers expanded the ancient irrigation systems of the valley, building new canals and maintaining old ones, ensuring that water reached every field under cultivation. Some canals ran for miles, carefully graded to move water by gravity alone, their courses adjusted to avoid obstacles and maintain the gentle slope necessary for consistent flow. Walk systems controlled and directed water, allowing farmers to flood their fields at appropriate times and drain them when necessary. The plazas and open spaces of Chan Chan hosted markets where goods from across the kingdom and beyond changed hands. Merchants brought dried fish from the coast and fresh produce from the fields. Highlanders descended from the Andes with potatoes and wool, metals and obsidian. Traders from the far north arrived with spondylus shells, the thorny oysters that held immense ritual significance and came only from the warm waters near the equator. These red and white shells were worth more than gold to Andean peoples, associated with the sea, with fertility, with the sacred forces that brought water and life. Controlling the trade in spondylus gave Chan Chan influence far beyond its military reach. The religious life of the city was woven into its fabric, though the specific beliefs and practices can now only be partially reconstructed from archaeological evidence and fragments preserved in later traditions. The moon appears to have held special significance, perhaps reflecting the importance of the sea and its tides to coastal peoples. Unlike highland Andean cultures that often emphasized the sun, the Chimu revered the lunar deity as supreme. The moon, called Si in the Moche language that the Chimu spoke, was considered more powerful than the sun, able to appear both day and night, ruling over the ocean's rhythms and thus over the abundance that the sea provided. Temples and shrines dotted the urban landscape, places where priests conducted ceremonies and where offerings were made to ensure cosmic order and earthly prosperity. The archaeological record preserves evidence of sacrifices, both of animals and, on important occasions, of humans. These were not acts of mere cruelty, but sacred practices believed essential to maintaining the relationship between the human and divine worlds. The victims, often young and carefully selected, were dressed in fine clothing and offered to the gods with elaborate ritual. Their deaths were meant to nourish the cosmos, to ensure that the sun would continue to rise, the rivers would continue to flow, and the kingdom would continue to prosper. As the 11th century progressed into the 12th, Chan Chan continued to grow. A second ciudadela was constructed, then a third, each new compound reflecting increased wealth and perhaps refinements in architectural planning. The layout of the city became more complex, with streets and walls creating a labyrinth of passages and enclosures. Water channels ran throughout, carrying precious water to gardens and serving practical needs. Wells were dug to access groundwater, supplementing the surface water from irrigation canals. The city was becoming one of the largest urban centers anywhere in the Americas, home to perhaps 30,000 people or more, a concentration of population unprecedented on the desert coast. The expansion of the kingdom beyond the Moche Valley accelerated during this period. Chimu armies moved northward into the Lambayeque valleys, regions that had their own proud traditions and that would not submit easily. These campaigns required sustained effort and careful strategy, as the Lambayeque peoples were sophisticated and militarily capable. To the south, Chimu forces pushed beyond Viru, bringing more valleys under their control and expanding the resource base that sustained Chan Chan's growth. Each conquest brought more tribute flowing to the capital, foodstuffs and textiles, precious metals and exotic goods, and most importantly, people whose labor could be mobilized for the kingdom's projects. The rulers who directed this expansion from their ciudadelas in Chan Chan were establishing patterns that would define Chimu civilization for the next 3 centuries. They were demonstrating that an empire could be built on the desert coast, that the environmental challenges that had constrained earlier cultures could be overcome through organization, engineering, and military might. They were creating an urban civilization in a place that seemed to defy urban concentration, marshalling the resources of a narrow coastal strip to sustain a capital city of unprecedented size. The Kingdom of Gold was taking shape, and Chan Chan stood at its heart, growing larger with each passing decade, its adobe walls rising higher, its compounds spreading wider, its ambitions reaching farther along the coast. The kingdom that emerged from Chan Chan was structured according to principles that balanced centralized authority with regional autonomy, creating a political system capable of governing territories spread across hundreds of miles of coastline. At the apex of this hierarchy stood the ruler himself, known by the title of Tie Kish, or perhaps Chimu Kapak, a sovereign who combined political, military, and religious authority in his person. He was not merely a king in the secular sense, but a sacred figure whose connection to the divine legitimized his rule and whose decisions shaped the cosmic as well as the earthly order. The person of the king was surrounded by elaborate protocols and restrictions that set him apart from common humanity. He did not walk on bare ground, but was carried on litters when he moved through the city, his feet never touching the earth that ordinary people trod. His clothing was woven from the finest textiles, his ornaments crafted from gold and silver, his headdresses adorned with feathers brought from distant tropical regions. When he appeared in public, it was as a figure of majesty designed to inspire awe and demonstrate the distance between ruler and ruled. Some accounts suggest he was served by a large retinue of wives and concubines, maintaining a court of considerable size within his ciudadela. Access to the king was carefully controlled through layers of intermediaries and officials. No common person could simply approach the ruler to air a grievance or request a favor. Instead, a hierarchy of nobles and administrators mediated between the king and his subjects, each level filtering information upward and commands downward. This system served multiple purposes. It magnified the king's authority by making access to him a precious privilege. It created opportunities for loyal servants to be rewarded with positions of influence, and it allowed the ruler to maintain some distance from the day-to-day difficulties of governance while still directing overall policy. Below the king, the highest tier of Chimu society consisted of the nobility, a class that included members of the royal family, the lords of subject valleys, and important officials in the capital. These nobles controlled lands and resources, commanded laborers and servants, and lived in substantial compounds of their own, smaller than the royal ciudadelas, but still impressive by most standards. They wore fine clothing and jewelry, though never matching the splendor of the king himself. They participated in the ceremonies and rituals that marked the passage of the seasons and the major events of the kingdom's life. Their children might be educated in specialized knowledge, learning the systems of record-keeping, the intricacies of water management, or the diplomatic skills necessary for administering subject populations. The noble class was not homogeneous but included gradations of status and authority. Some were lords of entire valleys, governing territories that had once been independent kingdoms and now formed provinces of the Chimu realm. These regional lords maintained considerable autonomy in local affairs, managing irrigation systems, collecting tribute, and administering justice, but they owed allegiance to Chan Chan and were required to provide resources and labor when the central government demanded them. Other nobles were officials appointed directly by the king, governors and administrators sent out from the capital to ensure royal authority was maintained and royal interests were protected. Beneath the nobility was a middle stratum of society that included skilled artisans, merchants, lower-level officials, and perhaps successful farmers who controlled more resources than the average peasant. The artisans who worked in the specialized crafts were particularly important in this tier. A master goldsmith or a highly skilled weaver might enjoy considerable prestige and relative comfort, their expertise valued, and their products sought after by the elite. These craftspeople were not wealthy by noble standards, but neither were they engaged in the backbreaking agricultural labor that occupied most of the population. They lived in neighborhoods near the ciudadelas, their workshops producing the objects that expressed Chimu culture and power. The merchants who facilitated trade across the kingdom and beyond also occupied this middle ground. Long-distance trade in the Andes was organized differently than in many other parts of the ancient world. There were no coins, no currency in the modern sense, and market exchanges operated through barter and reciprocal relationships rather than monetized transactions. Nevertheless, the movement of goods required specialists who understood different regions, who maintained networks of contacts, and who could organize caravans or maritime expeditions to transport goods across distances. These traders brought the spondylus shells from the north, the metals from highland mines, the exotic feathers and coca leaves that the elite desired. They were essential to the functioning of the kingdom's economy. The vast majority of the population, however, consisted of commoners who worked the land, fished the sea, and provided the labor that sustained the entire social edifice. These were the farmers who tended the irrigated fields, planting and harvesting the maize and beans, squash and peppers, cotton and chilies that fed the kingdom. They maintained the canals that brought water to their fields, a responsibility that required constant attention and collective effort. They paid tribute to their lords and to the central government, delivering portions of their harvests and providing labor for public works projects when required. Their lives were bound by the rhythms of agriculture and the demands of authority, their days spent in work that had changed little in its essentials for centuries. The mitar system organized the labor obligations of these commoners. This was a form of corvée labor, where communities were required to provide workers for state projects on a rotating basis. When the king commanded the construction of a new ciudadela, or the expansion of an irrigation canal, workers were conscripted through the emitter system to provide the necessary labor. They might be required to work for weeks or months away from their home villages, housed and fed by the state, while they labored on projects that served the broader kingdom. This system allowed the Chimu state to mobilize enormous amounts of labor for public works without maintaining a permanent workforce, instead drawing on the productive capacity of the entire population. Below even the commoners were those with less freedom still. Captured enemies might be enslaved, put to work on projects or in workshops where their labor benefited their captors. The llanas were a class of permanent servants attached to noble households or royal estates, hereditary dependents who worked the lands or performed domestic service for their masters. The exact legal and social status of these individuals is difficult to determine from archaeological evidence alone, but it is clear that Chimu society, like most ancient civilizations, included gradations of freedom, and that some people possessed far less autonomy than others. The administration of this complex society required sophisticated record-keeping and communication systems. The Chimu, like other Andean peoples, did not develop writing in the way that Mesopotamia or Mesoamerica did. Instead, they used the quipu, a system of knotted strings that could encode numerical information and possibly narrative content as well. A quipu consisted of a main cord from which hung numerous pendant strings, each string tied with knots at specific positions. The color of the strings, the type of knots, and their positions along the string all carried meaning. Specialists called quipucamayokes were trained to create and interpret these devices, managing the flow of information that allowed the central government to track tribute, organize labor, and coordinate the activities of far-flung territories. Messages and information traveled along routes that connected Chan to the provinces and the provinces to each other. Runners carried communications, memorizing messages or carrying quipus, moving with speed along established paths. These chasqui were part of a relay system where messages could be passed from runner to runner, allowing information to travel faster than any single individual could manage. The system required infrastructure including rest stations and supply points, as well as trained personnel who could maintain the pace day after day. It was one of the many administrative innovations that allowed the Chimu to control territories much larger than could be governed through direct personal oversight alone. The military organization of the kingdom evolved as its territory expanded. Early Chimu forces were probably relatively small, drawn from the population of the Moche Valley and sufficient to overawe or conquer neighboring valleys. As the kingdom grew, however, more systematic military structures became necessary. Warriors were drawn from various sources. Nobles and their retainers formed an elite force. Commoners were conscripted for campaigns, and subject populations might be required to provide troops. The forces that marched under Chimu banners included both infantry armed with clubs and spears and slingers who could hurl stones with devastating accuracy. Military success along the coast depended heavily on logistics and strategy rather than just battlefield prowess. Campaigns required supplying forces with food and water in an environment where both could be scarce away from the river valleys. The ability to move troops by sea gave the Chimu significant advantages, allowing them to bypass defensive positions or strike at unexpected locations. Reed boats and rafts could carry warriors along the coast, supplied by fishing communities who possessed the maritime skills necessary for coastal navigation. This naval dimension to Chimu military power has sometimes been overlooked, but it was crucial to their ability to project force across long distances. The conquest of each new valley followed similar patterns. Chimu forces would move to establish control, either through negotiation backed by the threat of force or through direct military action if resistance was offered. Once control was established, the irrigation systems would be assessed and often expanded or improved, increasing agricultural productivity and thus the tribute that could be extracted. Local lords might be confirmed in their authority if they accepted Chimu overlordship, or they might be replaced if they proved uncooperative. Marriages between Chimu nobles and local elites helped cement these new relationships, creating kinship ties that bound conquered territories to the capital. The territories absorbed into the kingdom were not uniformly integrated. Valleys closer to Chan Chan and those that had been under Chimu control for longer were more thoroughly incorporated into the administrative structures and more intensively exploited for resources. More distant territories, particularly those on the periphery of the kingdom, maintained greater autonomy and lighter tribute obligations, their inclusion in the kingdom being more nominal than actual. This flexibility allowed the Chimu to expand rapidly, claiming authority over vast stretches of coastline while focusing their administrative efforts on core territories where control was more easily maintained. By the mid-13th century, the Chimu Kingdom had established itself as the dominant power on the northern coast of Peru. Its territory stretched from the Lambayeque valleys in the north to the Santa Valley in the south, encompassing the most productive agricultural lands of the coastal desert. Chan Chan had grown into a metropolis, its ciudadelas housing the mummies of past kings and the courts of living ones, its streets filled with artisans and merchants, its warehouses stocked with tribute from subject territories. The political structures that governed this kingdom had been refined through decades of experience, creating systems that balanced central control with regional flexibility. The kings who ruled from their walled compounds were more than just military leaders or administrators. They were living links between the human and divine worlds, responsible for maintaining cosmic order through proper ritual observances. They were patrons of the arts and crafts that gave Chimu culture its distinctive character. They were engineers on a grand scale, directing projects that reshaped the landscape itself. They were the apex of a social pyramid that organized tens of thousands of people into a functioning whole, extracting surplus from the desert through human ingenuity and organized effort. The Kingdom of Gold had taken shape, its structures of power firmly established, its ambitions pointed toward further expansion along the coast. The relationship between the Chimu and metal was unlike that of any other ancient American civilization. While cultures throughout the Americas worked with gold and silver, copper and bronze, none achieved the scale of production or the technical sophistication that characterized Chimu metallurgy at its height. The workshops of Chan Chan and other Chimu centers produced objects in quantities that stagger the imagination, thousands upon thousands of items ranging from simple implements to elaborate masterpieces that rank among the finest metalwork ever created anywhere in the ancient world. This was not metalworking as a minor craft, but as a central expression of culture and power, an art form and technology that defined the kingdom's identity. The symbolic significance of precious metals in Chimu thought went far beyond simple value or rarity. Gold was associated with the sun and with masculine principles, its warm luster reflecting the solar light that gave life to the world. Silver, in contrast, was linked to the moon, to feminine forces, to the deity that the Chimu revered above all others. These were not arbitrary associations, but expressions of a worldview that saw correspondences between materials and cosmic powers, that understood objects made from these substances as participating in the nature of the divine forces they represented. To wear gold or silver was not merely to display wealth, but to embody connections to the sacred, to channel forces greater than the human. The technical knowledge required to work these metals had been accumulated over millennia of experimentation and practice. The Moche had been master metallurgists, and the Chimu inherited their techniques while developing innovations of their own. Working with native metals found in nugget form was the simplest approach, requiring only hammering and annealing to shape gold or silver into desired form. But much Andean metallurgy went far beyond such basic techniques, employing sophisticated methods that required precise control of temperature and composition, understanding of alloys and surface treatments, knowledge that took years to master and was passed from teacher to apprentice in carefully guarded traditions. Smelting allowed metallurgists to extract metal from ore rather than relying only on native deposits. This process required furnaces capable of reaching temperatures high enough to melt metal out of rock, and it demanded understanding of which ores contained which metals and how to separate wanted elements from waste materials. The Chimu smelters used small ceramic furnaces, often built on hillsides where wind could be channeled to increase temperatures. Blowpipes provided additional air to stoke the fire, while charcoal supplied the heat and reducing atmosphere necessary for smelting. The work was hot and difficult, requiring skill to judge temperatures by the color of the fire and experience to know when metal was ready to be poured. Alloying mixed different metals to create materials with properties distinct from the pure elements. Copper alloyed with tin created bronze, harder than either metal alone and useful for tools and weapons. Gold could be alloyed with copper to create tumbaga, a mixture that could be shaped more easily than pure gold, and that offered different color possibilities depending on the proportions of the metals involved. Silver could be combined with copper as well, creating alloys that extended precious metals and allowed for larger objects than would have been possible with pure gold or silver alone. These alloys were not merely economical compromises, but materials chosen for their specific characteristics and aesthetic qualities. Depletion gilding was perhaps the most remarkable technique in the Chimu metallurgical repertoire. This process began with an object made from tumbaga, the gold-copper alloy. The surface was then treated with plant juices containing acids that dissolved the copper from the outermost layer of the alloy, leaving behind a thin layer of nearly pure gold. When burnished, this surface appeared to be solid gold, though the interior remained copper-rich tumbaga. Objects created through this technique achieved the appearance of pure gold, while requiring far less of the precious metal, and the gold surface was permanent, not a plating that might wear away with use. The knowledge required to execute this process successfully demonstrates sophisticated understanding of chemistry and metallurgy. Casting allowed for the creation of complex forms that would be difficult or impossible to achieve through hammering alone. The lost wax technique was the primary method used. An artist would first create a model of the desired object from wax or a mixture of wax and other materials, carefully shaping every detail. This model was then encased in clay, leaving channels for molten metal to enter and for air to escape. When the clay mold was heated, the wax melted and ran out, leaving a cavity in the exact shape of the original model. Molten metal was poured into this cavity, filling the space where wax had been. After cooling, the clay mold was broken away to reveal the metal object inside. Each casting was unique, since the mold could only be used once, but the technique allowed for incredible precision and detail. The workshops where these techniques were practiced were concentrated in certain areas of Chan Chan and other Chimu centers. Archaeological excavations have revealed spaces filled with the debris of metalworking, fragments of molds, bits of slag from smelting, scrap metal trimmed away from finished objects, and the tools of the trade itself. These were not casual or occasional activities, but intensive production on an industrial scale. Some workshops appear to have specialized in particular products or techniques, with certain spaces dedicated to casting, while others focused on hammering and forming sheet metal. The organization suggests a high degree of specialization and coordination, with master craftspeople overseeing workshops that might employ multiple assistants and apprentices. The social position of skilled metallurgists was elevated but complex. They possessed knowledge that was valuable and that took years to acquire, making them essential to the functioning of elite culture and political power. A master goldsmith or silversmith enjoyed prestige and probably lived more comfortably than common farmers or laborers. Yet they remained dependent on elite patronage, working to produce objects that they could not themselves afford to own, creating symbols of power and status for others. The finest products of their workshops became possessions of the nobility and the royal court, used in ceremonies, worn as ornaments, buried with the dead as grave goods. The range of objects produced in Chimu workshops was extraordinary. Drinking cups called keros were crafted from gold or silver, their surfaces sometimes plain and polished, sometimes decorated with repoussé designs hammered from the inside to create raised patterns on the exterior. Ceremonial knives with semicircular blades, known as tumis, featured elaborate handles often depicting deities or important figures, their forms cast with incredible detail. Masks covered the faces of the dead, transforming them into beings of gold or silver as they entered the afterlife. Ear ornaments of remarkable size were worn by nobles, large discs suspended from ear spools that stretched the earlobes, these ornaments so heavy that wearers must have required considerable acclimatization. Crowns and headdresses incorporated metalwork along with feathers and textiles, creating composite objects where the glitter of gold complemented the brilliant colors of tropical bird plumage. Pectorals covered the chests of important individuals, large ornamental pieces suspended around the neck that announced status and identity to anyone who saw them. Bracelets and anklets, rings and nose ornaments, pins and plaques all emerged from the workshops, an endless variety of forms serving decorative, ceremonial, and symbolic purposes. The sheer quantity of metal objects in circulation among the Chimu elite was unprecedented in the Americas, representing a concentration of wealth and productive capacity that few other cultures achieved. The iconography that decorated these objects drew on a repertoire of images and symbols that expressed Chimu religious beliefs and cultural identity. Anthropomorphic deities appeared frequently, figures that combined human and animal characteristics in ways that suggested supernatural beings. The wave motif was ubiquitous, stylized representations of ocean waves that reflected the central importance of the sea to coastal peoples. Fish and seabirds appeared in many variations, sometimes naturalistic, sometimes abstracted into decorative patterns. The The moon, supreme deity of the Chimu, was represented in various forms, crescent shapes and full circles that adorned objects of every kind. Some of the most impressive metalwork combined multiple techniques and materials in single objects of stunning complexity. A tumi might feature a cast handle depicting a deity, with inlaid turquoise providing color contrast, and a carefully shaped blade attached to the whole. A large pectoral might incorporate hundreds of small dangles, each one individually cast and attached, creating an object that moved and glittered with every motion of the wearer. A crown could combine worked sheet metal with cast elements, feathers, textile components, and perhaps inlays of shell, stone, or other materials. These composite works represented not just technical skill but artistic vision, the ability to conceive of complex objects and then marshal the diverse skills necessary to realize that vision in physical form. The acquisition of raw materials for this metalworking industry required extensive networks of trade and tribute. The Chimu heartland on the coast was not rich in metal ores. Gold came from the north, from regions near the modern border with Ecuador, where ancient deposits had been worked for centuries. Silver was mined in the highlands, in the Andean Cordillera, where veins of ore cut through the mountains. Copper was more widely available but still had to be transported from mining regions to workshops in Chanchan and other centers. The flow of these materials to the coast was organized through a combination of long-distance trade, tribute from conquered territories, and perhaps direct control over some mining areas. The scale of production raised interesting questions about the ultimate fate of all these objects. Metal artifacts have a property that distinguishes them from pottery or textiles. They can be melted down and reworked into new forms. A damaged object or one that has gone out of fashion can be recycled, its material value preserved even as its original form is lost. This means that the quantity of metalwork visible in the archaeological record represents only a fraction of what was produced. Many objects were undoubtedly melted down at various times, their metal reused for new purposes. The truly staggering numbers appear in grave goods, objects buried with the dead, and thus removed from circulation, preserved in tombs until modern archaeology uncovered them. When Spanish conquistadors arrived on the coast in the 16th century, they were overwhelmed by the amount of gold and silver they found. They recorded seeing rooms filled with metal objects, storehouses of treasure beyond anything they had imagined. Most of this was promptly melted down, shipped to Spain as bullion to fill royal coffers and pay for European wars. In this destruction, centuries of artistic achievement were obliterated in months, priceless works of art reduced to anonymous bars of precious metal. What survived was largely what had been buried and forgotten, the grave goods that escaped Spanish notice or later looting, objects that remained hidden until archaeological excavation brought them back to light. Modern museum collections preserve some of the finest examples of Chimu metalwork, pieces that convey something of the artistry and technical skill that characterized this tradition. A gold beaker in a museum case, its surface worked in intricate designs, cannot fully communicate what it meant in its original context. It was not meant to be admired through glass under artificial light, but to be used in ceremonies, to contain sacred liquids, to be held in the hands of a noble or priest, to catch the light of fires or the sun and seem to glow with inner radiance. The context of use and belief is lost, leaving only the object itself as mute testimony to a culture that saw in worked metal something more than mere material value. The legacy of Chimu metallurgy extended beyond the kingdom itself. When the Inca conquered the coast, they were impressed by the metalworking skills they encountered. Chimu goldsmiths were reportedly taken to Cuzco to work for Inca rulers, their expertise valued even by their conquerors. The techniques and aesthetic sensibilities developed on the coast influenced highland metallurgy, contributing to the synthesis of styles that characterized the Inca Empire at its height. The tradition that had evolved over centuries of coastal civilization did not simply disappear with conquest but was absorbed and transformed, continuing in new forms under new masters. The fundamental challenge that shaped every aspect of Chimu civilization was the problem of water. The coastal desert received almost no rainfall, sometimes going years without a single significant storm. Every drop of water that sustained human life, that nourished crops in the fields, that filled storage vessels in the city, came from rivers that descended from the Andes. These rivers were the lifelines of settlement, fed by snowmelt and highland rains that fell far to the east in mountain ranges invisible from the coast. The volume of flow varied with the seasons, swelling during the wet months of the highland summer and dwindling during the dry season. Learning to harness this water and direct it where it was needed was not optional for coastal peoples, but absolutely essential for survival. The earliest farmers along the coast had begun the work of irrigation thousands of years before the Chimu emerged as a political force. Simple canals diverted water from rivers to nearby fields, extending the reach of agriculture beyond the natural floodplains. Each generation built on the work of those who came before, lengthening canals, improving techniques, expanding the area under cultivation. By the time the Chimu began consolidating their power, the valleys of the northern coast were already crisscrossed with irrigation infrastructure representing centuries of accumulated engineering knowledge. What the Chimu did was to take this existing system and expand it to unprecedented scales, organizing labor and resources to create irrigation networks of astonishing complexity and extent. The canals that carried water across the desert were marvels of precision engineering. They had to maintain a consistent gradient, sloping just enough to keep water flowing, but not so steeply that the current would erode the canal bed. Too little slope and water would pool and stagnate. Too much, and the canal would destroy itself, the rushing water cutting deeper and deeper until the structure failed. Chimu engineers calculated these grades with remarkable accuracy, laying out canals that ran for miles while maintaining the delicate balance necessary for reliable operation. They used simple tools for surveying, probably including wooden stakes and cord for sighting lines, along with accumulated experience that allowed them to judge slope by eye. The construction of a major canal required mobilizing enormous amounts of labor through the Moche system. Workers dug through soil and sometimes bedrock, removing millions of cubic yards of material to create channels deep and wide enough to carry substantial volumes of water. The spoil from excavation was piled to the sides, creating embankments that defined the canal course and sometimes served as pathways. In places where the terrain was uneven, workers might have to cut through hills or build aqueducts to carry water across depressions. The scale of earth moving involved in these projects was massive, accomplished without draft animals or wheeled vehicles, done entirely through human muscle power, organized and directed toward a common purpose. Once dug, canals required constant maintenance. Silt carried by the water gradually accumulated in the canal bed, reducing flow capacity and threatening to clog the system entirely. Regular cleaning was necessary, requiring workers to enter the canals and remove sediment. The walls of canals could erode or collapse, particularly in areas where soil was unstable. Damage from earthquakes, always a risk in this tectonically active region, had to be repaired quickly to restore water flow. Plants grew along the canal banks and sometimes within the channels themselves, requiring removal before they could obstruct flow. The Chimu developed administrative systems to ensure this maintenance was carried out, assigning responsibility for different canal sections to specific communities or officials who would be held accountable if problems arose. Control structures along the canals allowed for sophisticated management of water distribution. Sluice gates could be opened or closed to direct water into branch canals, diverting flow to different fields or neighborhoods as needed. These gates were simple in construction, often just wooden planks that could be inserted into slots, cut in stone or adobe, but their operation required coordination and authority. Someone had to decide when fields would receive water, how much each would get, and who would have priority when flow was limited during dry seasons. This water allocation was a source of power, a means by which the state and local authorities exercised control over subject populations whose survival depended on access to irrigation. The most ambitious hydraulic project undertaken by the Chimu was the Inca Valley Canal, an immense waterway designed to carry water from the Chicama Valley to the Moche Valley. This represented an audacious vision, connecting two separate valley systems, transferring water across the desert divide that separated them, expanding agricultural capacity beyond what the Moche River alone could support. The canal would have to run for more than 50 miles, crossing terrain that included hills and quebradas, loose sand and solid rock. The engineering challenges were formidable, but the potential rewards were equally significant. If successful, the canal would allow the Moche Valley, already the most populous and important part of the kingdom, to support even larger populations and more intensive agriculture. Work on the Inca Valley Canal appears to have been carried out in phases over an extended period. The scale of the project was enormous, requiring thousands of workers laboring for years to excavate the channel and construct the associated infrastructure. Sections of the canal were successfully completed, carrying water across miles of desert, demonstrating that the fundamental concept was sound. Workers carved through hillsides where necessary, creating cuts that remain visible in the landscape today. They built elevated sections where the canal had to cross low areas, constructing embankments to maintain the necessary gradient. The achievement was remarkable, pushing the limits of what was possible with the technology and organizational capacity available. Yet ultimately, the Inca Valley Canal was never completed. The sections that were finished operated for some time, but the full connection between the Chicama and Moche systems was not achieved. The reasons for abandonment remain debated. Perhaps the engineering challenges proved insurmountable in critical sections where the terrain was particularly difficult. Perhaps the labor requirements became unsustainable, drawing too many workers away from agriculture and other essential activities for too long. Perhaps political changes or shifts in priorities caused the project to be abandoned before completion. Whatever the reason, the incomplete canal stands as testimony both to the ambition of Chimu engineering and to the limits that even the most organized ancient states faced when attempting to reshape the landscape on such scales. The fields that received water from these canals were carefully managed to maximize productivity. Farmers understood crop rotation and practiced it to maintain soil fertility, alternating between crops that depleted the soil and those that replenished it. Maize was the most important crop, a staple that provided calories and could be stored for extended periods. Multiple varieties were grown, adapted to different elevations and soil conditions. Beans provided protein and fixed nitrogen in the soil, improving fertility for subsequent crops. Squash and other cucurbits complemented the maize and beans, creating the agricultural trinity that sustained populations throughout the Americas. Cotton was grown extensively, not for food but for fiber. The textile industry required vast amounts of raw material, and cotton thrived in the warm coastal valleys. It was harvested, cleaned, spun into thread, and woven into cloth in workshops throughout the kingdom. The finest textiles rivaled metalwork in their artistry and value, serving as markers of status and objects worthy of being buried with the dead. Fields dedicated to cotton production were as important as those growing food crops, supporting an industry that was central to Chimu culture and economy. Aji peppers added flavor and heat to the coastal diet, while other crops, including sweet potatoes, peanuts, and various fruits, provided diversity and nutrition. The Chimu also cultivated plants that served non-food purposes: gourds for containers, reeds for matting and boat building, and trees that provided wood for construction and fuel. The agricultural system was thus complex and diversified, producing not just calories but the full range of materials that supported urban civilization. Fertilization was crucial for maintaining productivity in fields that were cultivated year after year. The most important fertilizer came from the sea in the form of guano, the accumulated droppings of seabirds that nested on offshore islands. These deposits were extraordinarily rich in nitrogen and other nutrients, and their value was well understood by coastal peoples. The Chimu organized expeditions to harvest guano, transporting it from the islands to fields throughout their territory. This resource was so valuable that access to guano islands was carefully controlled, with certain islands assigned to support specific agricultural areas. The use of marine fertilizer to enhance terrestrial agriculture represented another way the Chimu integrated the exploitation of different environmental zones. Fish meal provided another source of fertilizer, along with protein for human consumption. The abundance of anchovies and other small fish in the cold waters of the Humboldt Current was extraordinary, and coastal peoples had exploited this resource for millennia. Some of the catch was dried and consumed directly, but substantial quantities were apparently processed into meal that could be used to enrich fields or feed to animals. This direct connection between the marine and agricultural systems was characteristic of coastal Andean civilization, an integration of resources from different environments that allowed populations to flourish in regions that would otherwise have supported far fewer people. Storage of water and agricultural products was essential for managing the seasonal variations in supply. Reservoirs captured water during periods of high flow, holding it for use during dry seasons when river levels dropped. These were not massive concrete structures but earthen basins, often located at strategic points in the irrigation system where they could regulate flow and provide backup supply. The construction and maintenance of reservoirs required engineering skill and substantial labor, but the benefits were considerable in smoothing out seasonal fluctuations and providing security against drought. Granaries stored the harvests, protecting maize and other crops from moisture and pests. These structures varied in size from small household storage rooms to large communal facilities that held tribute grain destined for Chan or other administrative centers. The ability to store food for extended periods was crucial to supporting urban populations who did not grow their own food, to maintaining armies on campaign, and to providing security against crop failures. The administrative systems that tracked these stores, recorded in quipus, allowed managers to know what resources were available and to plan distribution accordingly. The agricultural calendar that governed planting and harvesting was embedded in religious observance and astronomical knowledge. The timing of planting was critical in an environment where growing seasons were determined by water availability rather than temperature. Plant too early and seeds might not receive adequate moisture. Plant too late and crops might not mature before water supplies diminished. The priests and officials who tracked the movement of celestial bodies and marked the passage of the seasons played practical roles in determining when agricultural work should begin, when canals should be opened, when harvests should be gathered. The success of Chimu hydraulic engineering can be measured in the populations it supported. Chan at its height was home to perhaps 30,000 people or more, an urban concentration unprecedented on the coast. Across the kingdom, hundreds of thousands of people lived in cities, towns, and farming villages, all depending on agricultural systems that existed only because of irrigation. The fields that fed these populations stretched across valleys from the Lambayeque region to the Santa, tens of thousands of acres under cultivation, every acre watered by canals that human hands had built and human labor maintained. The environmental costs of this intensive agriculture were not negligible. Salinization, the accumulation of salts in soil from repeated irrigation, was an ongoing problem. In arid regions, irrigation water brings dissolved salts that remain in the soil as water evaporates, gradually increasing salt concentrations to levels that can harm or kill crops. The Chimu dealt with this through drainage systems that allowed salts to be flushed from fields, but the problem could not be entirely eliminated. Some agricultural lands were probably abandoned when salinization made them unproductive, requiring expansion into new areas to maintain overall output. The irrigation infrastructure the Chimu created transformed the landscape in permanent ways. Many of the canals they built are still visible centuries after they ceased to function, linear features etched into the desert, evidence of engineering achievement that shaped the coast for generations. Some were later restored and continued to be used under Inca rule and even into the Spanish colonial period. The knowledge of how to manage water in arid environments, refined over millennia of coastal civilization and brought to its highest expression by the Chimu, represented an achievement as significant as their metalwork or architecture. In the desert, water was life, and those who controlled water controlled life itself. The artistic traditions of the Chimu expressed a sensibility distinct from the cultures that preceded them, a shift in aesthetic values that marked their work as recognizably different from Moche art, even as it drew on that earlier heritage. Where Moche ceramics had often featured painted scenes of remarkable narrative complexity and naturalistic representation, Chimu pottery emphasized form and surface treatment, favoring monochrome vessels with sculptural presence. The shift was not a loss of skill but a change in what was valued, a redefinition of what beauty meant and how objects should communicate meaning and status. The most characteristic Chimu pottery was the blackware that became synonymous with their culture. These vessels were crafted from clay that fired to a dark grey or black color, achieved through a reduction firing technique that limited oxygen in the kiln during the final stages of heating. The resulting surface could be burnished to a lustrous shine that caught light and seemed to glow from within. The aesthetic effect was sophisticated and restrained, an elegance that did not depend on bright colors or elaborate painted decoration. Instead, the beauty emerged from the purity of form, the quality of surface treatment, and the subtle modeling of sculptural elements. The shapes of Chimu vessels followed conventions that had evolved over generations of ceramic production. Stirrup spout bottles, inherited from Moche tradition, remained common, their distinctive spouts forming arcs that connected 2 points on the vessel's upper surface. Bottles with single spouts, sometimes whistling bottles designed to make sounds when liquid was poured from them, appeared in numerous variations. Large storage jars called aribalos, though more common in highland traditions, were also produced on the coast. Smaller vessels served as drinking cups offering containers or personal items carried as possessions. The forms were functional but also aesthetic, shapes refined through countless iterations to achieve a visual harmony that satisfied the eye. Decoration on Chimu pottery often took the form of molded relief rather than painting. Geometric patterns covered surfaces pressed into the clay while it was still soft using stamps or molds. Stylized representations of marine life appeared frequently, fish and waves rendered in abstracted forms that suggested movement and the flowing nature of water. Anthropomorphic figures were sometimes modeled onto vessels, faces emerging from the clay, or full figures standing as sculptural elements. These decorative motifs drew from a shared vocabulary of images that would have been immediately readable to Chimu viewers, communicating meanings that are now partially lost, but that clearly mattered to the people who made and used these objects. Molds allowed for mass production of certain vessel types, while maintaining consistency of decoration. A potter would create a master form, carefully shaping and decorating it to achieve the desired appearance. From this master, molds could be made that allowed multiple copies to be produced. Clay pressed into these molds would take on the form and decoration of the original, allowing workshops to create numerous vessels of the same design. This technique did not eliminate the need for skill, as the clay still had to be properly prepared, the molds correctly used, and the vessels finished and fired with care. but it did allow for greater output and standardization, supporting the demand for pottery from a large urban population. The production of ceramics was organized in specialized workshops, areas of the city where potters worked together with access to kilns and supplies of clay. The locations of these workshops were determined partly by practical considerations: proximity to clay sources, availability of fuel for firing, access to water for preparing clay. But social factors also mattered, as potters formed communities of practice where knowledge was shared and passed down through apprenticeship. A young person learning the craft would spend years observing and assisting, gradually taking on more complex tasks as skill developed, eventually becoming a master potter capable of producing vessels of the highest quality. Textile production was even more labor-intensive than pottery, requiring vast amounts of time for every stage from preparing fibers to creating finished cloth. Cotton had to be harvested, cleaned of seeds and debris, and spun into thread. Wool from highland camelids brought to the coast through trade required similar processing. The spinning itself was done with simple drop spindles, weighted sticks that twisted fibers into thread through rotation. Hour after hour, day after day, spinners transformed raw fiber into the thread that weavers would use, accumulating thread in quantities sufficient for the textile projects that clothed the population and served ritual purposes. Weaving took place on backstrap looms, simple but effective devices where one end of the loom was attached to a fixed point and the other to a strap that passed around the weaver's back. By leaning backward, the weaver could tension the threads and create the space necessary for passing the weft through the warp. The technique required skill and stamina, as weavers spent hours in positions that strained the back and arms. Yet the results could be extraordinary. Textiles of remarkable fineness and complexity emerging from these simple tools in the hands of master weavers. The finest Chimu textiles incorporated multiple colors and complex patterns. Dyes were extracted from plants, minerals, and animals, creating palettes that included reds and yellows, blues and purples, earth tones, and brilliant hues. The actual purple dye from mollusks was particularly valued, produced from sea snails in a process that required thousands of creatures to generate small amounts of colorant. Textiles dyed with this precious substance were reserved for the highest elite, markers of supreme status that could not be duplicated by lesser artisans. Other dyes were more accessible but still required knowledge of which plants yielded which colors, how to prepare them, and how to fix them so they would not fade. Tapestry weaving allowed for the creation of pictorial and geometric designs within the textile itself. Unlike simpler weaves where pattern came from arrangement of colored threads, tapestry involved discontinuous wefts that could create areas of different colors within a single fabric. The technique was time-consuming, requiring weavers to work from designs and constantly change thread colors, but it produced textiles of stunning beauty and complexity. Geometric patterns predominated, though some tapestries included stylized representations of figures and symbols. The finished products were works of art as significant as any painting, expressing cultural values and aesthetic sensibilities through textile media. Featherwork represented another specialized craft that combined multiple skills. Tropical birds from the eastern forests beyond the Andes had plumage of extraordinary brilliance, feathers in shades of red and blue, green and yellow that could not be achieved with dyes. These feathers reached the coast through long-distance trade networks exchanged through multiple hands over hundreds of miles. Once obtained, they were incorporated into textiles and headdresses, attached to backing materials with careful stitching that secured them while displaying their colors to best effect. Feathered textiles were reserved for special occasions and important individuals, their brilliant colors announcing status and connecting wearers to distant tropical regions associated with exotic power. Woodworking produced objects both utilitarian and ceremonial. The coastal environment did not offer abundant timber, as the desert valleys contained few large trees. Wood had to be obtained from highland forests or from the algarobo trees that grew in some coastal areas. Despite these limitations, Chimu woodworkers created an array of objects including ceremonial paddles, carved figures, architectural elements, and containers. The wood was shaped with copper and bronze tools, harder than the wood itself and capable of carving and cutting. Some wooden objects were inlaid with shell or precious metals, creating composite works that combined materials and techniques from multiple craft traditions. Shell working was a specialized skill that transformed marine and terrestrial shells into objects of beauty and ritual significance. Spondylus shells, the thorny oysters from tropical waters, were the most prized. These shells were cut, ground, and polished to create beads, inlays, and figurines. The red and white coloration of spondylus made it particularly valued, the colors themselves carrying symbolic meaning. Other shells were worked as well, including mother of pearl from local sources that could be cut into geometric shapes and used for inlay work on textiles, wood, or other materials. The skill required to work shell without shattering it demanded experience and careful technique. Artisans who worked in these various media formed specialized communities within Chimu society. They were not isolated individuals working alone, but participants in craft traditions that involved training, shared knowledge, and collective identity. The workshops where they labored were often located in specific neighborhoods of cities like Chan, creating areas where particular crafts were concentrated. This geographical clustering facilitated the exchange of ideas and techniques, while also making it easier for authorities to oversee production and collect finished goods as tribute or tax. The social status of artisans varied depending on their skills and the prestige of their craft. A master goldsmith enjoyed higher status than a potter, reflecting both the value of the materials worked and the sophistication of the techniques involved. Yet even relatively humble crafts required skill and knowledge that commanded some respect. The textile workers who created the finest tapestries, the feather workers who assembled elaborate headdresses, the shell workers who carved delicate figures all possessed expertise that took years to acquire and that contributed essential elements to elite culture and ritual life. The aesthetic principles that unified Chimu art across different media emphasized certain recurring themes and approaches. Symmetry was often valued, with balanced compositions that reflected order and harmony. Stylization was preferred over naturalism in many contexts, with animals and human figures rendered in conventional forms that prioritized recognizability and symbolic content over realistic representation. The integration of different materials in single objects was common, with artisans combining metals with textiles, shell with wood, feathers with woven cloth to create composite works that showcased multiple craft traditions simultaneously. The motifs that appeared in Chimu art drew from a relatively limited iconographic vocabulary but deployed these elements in endless variations. The wave motif appeared everywhere, from textiles to metalwork to pottery, rendered in forms that ranged from naturalistic to highly abstract. Pelicans and other seabirds were frequently depicted, sometimes alone, sometimes in groups, sometimes catching fish in their beaks. Fish themselves appeared as single figures or in repeating patterns, their bodies simplified to essential forms. Human figures, when represented, often appeared in profile or frontal views that emphasized certain features while suppressing others, following conventions that made figures recognizable as types rather than specific individuals. Religious imagery infused much artistic production, though the precise meanings are now difficult to reconstruct. Figures with elaborate headdresses and ornaments, possibly representing deities or important ancestors, appeared on various media. Scenes that might depict rituals or mythological events occasionally decorated pottery and textiles. The moon, revered as the supreme deity, appeared in crescent and full forms. The sea, source of life and abundance, was referenced through the countless representations of marine creatures and waves. The artistic traditions served not just decorative purposes but communicated cultural values and religious concepts, making art an integral part of how the Chimu understood and expressed their place in the cosmos. The production of all these artistic goods required substantial infrastructure beyond just the skills of individual artisans. Raw materials had to be acquired and distributed, finished products collected and redistributed. Storage facilities held materials and completed objects. Administrative systems tracked production and ensured that tribute requirements were met. The scale of organization necessary to support the artistic output visible in the archaeological record suggests sophisticated management, with officials overseeing workshops, allocating resources, and coordinating the efforts of numerous specialists working in different crafts. When Spanish conquistadors encountered Chimu material culture, they focused primarily on the metalwork, seeing gold and silver as the valuable elements while largely ignoring the artistic and technical sophistication of textiles, ceramics, and other crafts. This bias has affected what survived and what was recorded, with countless textiles destroyed and pottery dismissed as unimportant. Yet the full picture of Chimu artistic achievement requires appreciating the full range of craft production, recognizing that beauty and meaning were expressed through multiple media, and that skilled artisans working in every craft contributed to a cultural flowering that characterized the Kingdom of Gold at its height. The religious life of the Chimu was not separate from their political and social existence, but thoroughly woven through every aspect of their culture. The cosmos they inhabited was animated by forces that required constant attention and ritual maintenance. The gods were not distant or abstract, but immediately present in the world, manifested in the moon's phases and the ocean's rhythms, in the fertility of fields and the abundance of fish. Human prosperity depended on maintaining right relationships with these forces, on performing the ceremonies that kept the universe in balance and ensured that divine powers continued to bestow their blessings on the kingdom. The supreme deity of Chimu religion was the moon, called Si, in the Moche language that coastal peoples spoke. This elevation of the lunar over the solar represented a distinctive choice, one that differentiated coastal religion from highland traditions that often emphasized the sun as the paramount force. The preference for the moon may have reflected the maritime orientation of coastal culture. The tides that governed the rhythms of fishing and marine resource exploitation were caused by lunar gravity. The moon appeared both day and night, demonstrating a power that transcended the sun's limitation to daylight hours. In the Chimu worldview, the moon had actually created the sun and the stars, and was thus the ultimate source of all celestial light and order. The moon's phases provided a calendar that structured time and organized ritual activity. The full moon was a period of particular power and importance, perhaps associated with ceremonies and offerings. The new moon marked transitions and beginnings. The waxing and waning of lunar light corresponded to cycles of growth and decline that could be read in natural phenomena and that required human ritual response to maintain cosmic harmony. Lunar eclipses must have been especially significant and perhaps frightening events, moments when the supreme deity disappeared from the sky and required special ceremonies to ensure its return. The sea itself was understood as sacred, a realm of divine power that provided the abundance on which coastal peoples depended. The ocean was not merely a resource to be exploited, but a living presence with its own will and moods. Storms that destroyed fishing boats and swept away coastal settlements demonstrated the sea's terrible power. The regular return of fish during certain seasons and the reliability of marine resources in normal times showed the sea's beneficence when properly honored. Offerings were made to the ocean, precious objects cast into the waves to maintain good relationships with the marine realm and ensure continued abundance. The connection between the moon and the sea was recognized and incorporated into religious understanding. The tides that rose and fell were visible demonstrations of lunar power over the ocean. The fact that the highest tides occurred during full and new moons provided empirical evidence of the relationship between these two sacred forces. In Chimu thought, the moon thus governed not just the night sky, but the very waters that were central to coastal existence, making lunar worship a practical as well as spiritual necessity. Other deities and supernatural forces populated the Chimu cosmos, though their identities and relationships are now difficult to reconstruct with certainty. Marine creatures, particularly those that were important food sources, may have been understood as having spiritual dimensions or as being under the protection of specific supernatural powers. The spondylus shell from tropical waters was associated with fertility and water, perhaps because these shells came from warmer seas where El Niño events originated and thus were connected to the rare but vital rains that such events brought to the coast. Mountains visible on the distant horizon to the east, the Andean peaks where the rivers originated, were likely understood as sacred, the sources of life-giving water, and thus worthy of reverence. The priesthood that mediated between human and divine worlds held positions of significant authority. These religious specialists possessed knowledge of rituals and ceremonies, of the proper ways to approach the gods and the correct forms of offerings. They maintained the ceremonial calendar, determining when particular rites should be performed, and coordinating the activities necessary for major religious observances. They interpreted omens and signs, reading meaning in unusual natural phenomena, in the behavior of animals, in dreams and visions. Their expertise was essential for maintaining cosmic order, and this gave them influence that extended into political and social realms. Priests were likely drawn from elite families, their positions hereditary or at least restricted to those of appropriate social standing. The training required to master the complex knowledge of ritual and cosmology probably began in childhood, with young candidates learning from established priests over years of apprenticeship. They would need to memorize ceremonies, learn the proper handling of sacred objects, understand the meanings of various symbols and signs, and develop the presence and authority necessary to lead rituals before assembled crowds. The role demanded not just knowledge but performative skill, the ability to embody divine presence and conduct ceremonies in ways that inspired awe and reinforced belief. The ceremonial architecture of Chan Chan and other Chimu centers provided stages for ritual performance. Within the ciudadelas, special platforms and audience chambers served as settings for ceremonies that might have involved only the ruler and a select group of priests and nobles. The open plazas could accommodate larger gatherings, perhaps for festivals that involved broader participation. The walls decorated with marine imagery created symbolic environments surrounding ritual participants with representations of the sacred forces being honored. The sheer scale of these architectural spaces reinforced the importance of what transpired within them, dwarfing human figures, creating settings worthy of divine attention. Human sacrifice was practiced by the Chimu, continuing a tradition that had deep roots in Andean civilization. Archaeological evidence reveals the remains of sacrificial victims, often young individuals selected for specific characteristics. These were not casual killings, but carefully orchestrated ritual events with specific purposes and meanings. The victims might be children offered to ensure agricultural fertility, or adults sacrificed to mark important events like the death of a ruler. They were dressed in fine clothing, sometimes given sacred substances to consume, and killed in ways that varied according to the specific ritual context. Their bodies were buried with care, treated as sacred remains that had served crucial cosmic purposes. The logic of human sacrifice in Andean thought was not one of appeasement of angry gods, but of reciprocity and cosmic feeding. The gods provided life and abundance to humans, and humans owed debts that could only be repaid through valuable offerings. Human life was the most precious gift that could be given, demonstrating the seriousness of human devotion and providing the gods with the vital essence they required. The sacrificial victim became a messenger to the divine realm, a bridge between human and supernatural worlds. The death was thus not meaningless violence, but a transformation that served cosmic purposes and benefited the entire community. Animal sacrifice was more common and occurred in various contexts. Llamas and other camelids from the highlands were ritually killed, their blood spilled as offerings and their meat consumed in ceremonial feasts. Guinea pigs, raised throughout the Andes for food, were sacrificed in smaller rituals. Dogs occasionally appear in sacrificial contexts, though their meaning is less clear. Marine creatures, especially fish, may have been offered to the sea or to the moon, returned to their divine sources as acknowledgement of the gifts received. The sacrifice of animals was woven into the fabric of religious life, a constant background of offering and reciprocity that maintained relationships with supernatural forces. Offerings of objects complemented the sacrifice of living beings. Pottery vessels, often specially made for ritual contexts, were broken or buried as offerings. Textiles were burned or interred, their beauty and the labor invested in creating them making them worthy gifts to the gods. Metal objects, particularly those made from precious metals, were offered in various contexts. The burial of valuable objects in tombs can be understood as a form of offering, removing these items from circulation and dedicating them to the dead and to the supernatural realm. Spondylus shells were particularly important offerings, their rarity and symbolic associations making them supremely valuable gifts. Huacas were sacred places or objects that possessed supernatural power. These could be natural features like unusual rock formations, springs, or stretches of coastline. They could be ancient ruins, the monuments of ancestors that remain charged with spiritual significance. They could be man-made shrines or specific objects that had become sacred through association with important events or through ritual consecration. The landscape was dotted with these sites of power, and traveling through territory involved navigating not just physical space, but a religious geography where certain places demanded offerings and respectful behavior. The cult of the dead was central to Chimu religion, as it was throughout Andean civilization. The dead were not gone but remained present, their mummified bodies preserved and maintained by descendants. Important ancestors continued to own property and receive offerings, their wishes communicated through priests or family members who spoke on their behalf. The great ciudadelas where rulers were buried became eternal residences, maintained by retainers and regularly visited for ceremonies. The boundaries between living and dead were permeable, with the ancestors remaining active participants in the affairs of their descendants. Burial practices reflected social hierarchy as they revealed religious beliefs. Elite burials were elaborate affairs, with the deceased dressed in finest textiles and surrounded by goods they might need or that demonstrated their status. Retainers and wives might be killed to accompany important individuals into death, providing them with servants and companions in the afterlife. The bodies were positioned carefully, often in seated positions, wrapped in layers of textiles that formed mummy bundles. Grave goods included pottery and tools, jewelry and weapons, food and drink for the journey. The tombs themselves were substantial structures, underground chambers that required significant labor to construct and that were designed to protect their contents for eternity. Commoner burials were simpler, but still reflected care for the dead. Bodies were wrapped and positioned with attention to proper form. Modest grave goods accompanied the deceased, simple pottery and tools, personal items that had belonged to them in life. The locations of burials in cemeteries near settlements allowed for continued connection between living and dead, with family members able to visit and make offerings. Even in death, social distinctions persisted, with the elaborate tombs of the elite contrasting sharply with the modest interments of ordinary people. Divination and prophecy played roles in decision-making, particularly for important matters affecting the kingdom. Specialists read omens in various phenomena, interpreting signs to determine favorable times for undertaking campaigns, planting crops or conducting ceremonies. The flight of birds, the behavior of animals, unusual weather events, earthquakes, and celestial phenomena all provided information that skilled interpreters could decode. Dreams and visions might reveal divine intentions or warn of future events. The consultation of oracles at sacred sites could provide guidance on matters of state. These divinatory practices gave religious specialists influence over political and military decisions as rulers sought supernatural sanction for their actions. Pilgrimage connected different parts of the kingdom through religious networks. People traveled to important huacas and ceremonial centers, sometimes covering great distances to participate in festivals or seek blessings at particularly powerful sites. These journeys created connections between regions, spreading information and goods along with religious practices. The pilgrimage routes became paths of cultural exchange, reinforcing the unity of the kingdom through shared religious experience, even as they also maintained ties to older, pre-Chimu sacred sites that continued to command reverence. The integration of political and religious authority in the person of the ruler meant that the king's power was understood as both earthly and cosmic. He was not just a successful military leader or skilled administrator, but a sacred figure whose very existence maintained order. His performance of rituals was not optional, but essential, a duty that only he could fulfill. The elaborate ciudadelas where he lived and would eventually be buried were as much religious architecture as palaces, spaces designed to facilitate the ceremonies that kept the cosmos functioning properly. When a ruler died, the crisis was both political and religious, a rupture in the fabric of reality that required careful management through succession rituals that transferred sacred authority to the next king. The Spanish who eventually conquered the coast found Chimu religion incomprehensible and demonic, a system of devil worship that had to be extirpated. They destroyed huacas and persecuted religious practitioners, attempting to replace indigenous beliefs with Christianity. Yet the suppression was never complete and elements of pre-Hispanic religion persisted, sometimes openly and sometimes hidden beneath Catholic forms. The sacred geography of huacas remained meaningful to indigenous peoples long after the conquest, and offerings continued to be made at ancient sites. The dead continued to be honored, and the old gods, though driven underground, did not entirely disappear from Andean religious consciousness. By the early 15th century, the Chimu Kingdom had reached the apex of its power and territorial extent. The conquests that had begun centuries earlier in the valleys immediately surrounding Chan Chan had expanded outward in both directions along the coast, until Chimu authority stretched across nearly 1,000 miles of the Pacific shoreline. From the far northern frontier near Tumbes, where the desert began to give way to the more tropical climate of what is now Ecuador, all the way south to the Chilon and Rimac valleys where the modern city of Lima now stands, the coastal valleys acknowledged the supremacy of Chan Chan and sent tribute to its rulers. This was an empire by any reasonable definition, a political entity that controlled diverse territories and populations through a combination of military force, administrative skill, and cultural prestige. The northern frontier of the kingdom extended into regions that were environmentally and culturally distinct from the Chimu heartland. The Tumbes area received more rainfall than the hyper-arid zones farther south, supporting different agricultural patterns and settlement types. The populations here had their own traditions and identities, and incorporating them into the Chimu realm required accommodating these differences while still extracting tribute and enforcing loyalty. The strategic importance of the northern territories lay partly in their role as sources of exotic goods, particularly the spondylus shells that came from tropical waters and that held such immense ritual and economic value throughout the Andes. The southern expansion had pushed Chimu control into valleys that had previously been independent or loosely affiliated with other regional powers. The conquest of the Lima area represented the furthest extent of sustained Chimu authority, bringing under their control valleys that were hundreds of miles from Chan Chan. Maintaining authority at such distances required administrative infrastructure and the ability to project military force when necessary. The valleys near Lima were productive and populous, making them valuable additions to the kingdom, but they also represented the practical limits of how far coastal power could effectively extend from a single center. Between these far-flung frontiers lay the core territories of the kingdom, the valleys of the north coast that had been under Chimu control for generations, and that were most thoroughly integrated into the political and economic systems centered on Chan Chan. The Moche Valley remained the heart of the realm, home to the capital and the largest concentration of population and resources. The Chicama Valley to the north was intensively cultivated and contributed substantially to the agricultural surplus that sustained the urban population. The Lambayeque valleys, conquered earlier in Chimu expansion, were wealthy regions with their own strong traditions that enriched the cultural synthesis of the kingdom. The administration of this extensive territory required systems of governance that could function across distances that made regular direct oversight impractical. Regional lords in the various valleys administered their territories with considerable autonomy, managing local irrigation, resolving disputes, and organizing labor for local projects. These lords owed allegiance to Chan Chan and were expected to provide tribute and military support when called upon, but the day-to-day governance was in their hands. Some were members of local dynasties that had been confirmed in power after submitting to Chimu authority. Others were relatives of the ruling family in Chan Chan, sent out to govern important regions and ensure loyalty to the center. The flow of tribute from subject territories to Chan Chan sustained the capital's grandeur and the elaborate court life of the elite. Agricultural products arrived from the productive valleys: maize and beans, chilies and cotton, all the crops that fed the urban population and supplied the workshops. Finished textiles came as tribute, woven by subject populations and delivered to Chan Chan, where they might be redistributed, stored, or used to clothe retainers and servants. Fish, dried and preserved, traveled from coastal fishing communities to supply protein to those who did not directly harvest the sea. The volume of goods moving through the tribute system was enormous, representing the organized extraction of surplus from an entire region. Prestige goods flowed along different channels, acquired through trade and specialized procurement rather than regular tribute. Gold and silver came from mining regions, some within Chimu territory but others beyond the kingdom's borders, obtained through trade with highland peoples or with groups in the far north. Copper, for alloying and for tools, came from mines that were worked by subject populations or controlled through agreements with those who owned the deposits. Spondylus shells, those precious red and white treasures from tropical seas, were acquired through long-distance trade networks that extended hundreds of miles beyond Chimu frontiers. The trade networks that connected the Chimu Kingdom to more distant regions were complex and multi-layered. Coastal merchants traveled by boat, paddling reed watercraft or sailing on balsa rafts that could carry substantial cargoes. These maritime traders moved along the coast, stopping at fishing villages and ports, exchanging goods and information as they went. Some voyages reached far to the north into what is now Ecuador, and perhaps beyond, seeking the warm water resources that could not be obtained closer to home. The maritime trade was ancient on this coast, predating the Chimu by millennia, but under their rule it reached new scales of organization and volume. Highland trade connected the coast to the Andean interior, a complementary relationship that had characterized Andean civilization for thousands of years. The coast needed products from the mountains, wool from highland camelids, metals from Andean mines, obsidian for cutting tools, and various highland crops including potatoes and quinoa. The highlanders in turn desired coastal products, dried fish and shellfish that provided protein not readily available in the mountains, cotton that did not grow at high elevations, spondylus shells that held ritual significance throughout the Andes, and the prestige goods that coastal artisans produced. Caravans of llamas carried goods up and down between these environmental zones, their routes, ancient paths that connected different ecological niches in networks of exchange. The wealth that flowed through these systems manifested most visibly in Chan Chan itself, where the ciudadelas continued to grow in number and size. By the time of maximum Chimu power, 10 of these great compounds stood within the urban core, each one representing the reign of a different ruler and serving as both palace and eventual tomb. The city sprawled across several square miles, its adobe walls creating a labyrinth of passages and enclosures. The population may have reached 40,000 or more, making it one of the largest cities anywhere in the Americas at that time. The concentration of people, resources, and productive activities made Chan Chan a center of innovation and cultural production that influenced the entire kingdom. The marketplace of Chan Chan brought together goods from across the empire and beyond. Farmers from nearby fields brought fresh produce. Fishermen arrived with their catches from the ocean just a few miles away. Craftspeople offered their wares, pottery and textiles, tools and ornaments. Merchants displayed exotic goods from distant places, shells and feathers, metals and stones. The exchanges that took place were not monetized in the modern sense, as the Andes lacked currency, but complex systems of barter and reciprocal relationships governed transactions. Some exchanges were immediate, goods traded for other goods on the spot. Others involved deferred obligations, creating relationships that would be fulfilled over time through multiple transactions. The storage facilities within the ciudadelas and throughout the city held vast quantities of goods. Large rooms were filled with pottery vessels containing foodstuffs, textiles in various stages of production, raw materials awaiting use by artisans, and finished objects ready for distribution. The scale of these storage operations required record-keeping systems to track what was held, where, who had contributed what tribute, and how resources should be allocated. The quipus that recorded this information were themselves stored in organized archives, creating a bureaucratic apparatus that managed the flow of goods through the economic system. The economic prosperity of the kingdom was not evenly distributed but concentrated among the elite classes. The rulers and high nobility lived in luxury that few others could imagine, surrounded by gold and silver, dressed in the finest textiles, eating foods prepared by specialist cooks, and attended by numerous servants. Their homes were filled with beautiful objects, their persons adorned with jewelry and insignia of rank, their lives dedicated as much to ceremony and display as to governance. This concentration of wealth was not seen as unjust but as proper, a reflection of the cosmic order where hierarchy and differentiation were natural and necessary. Below the highest elite, the lesser nobility and successful artisans enjoyed comfortable, if less spectacular lives. They had access to goods beyond basic necessities, wore clothing of quality, if not supreme fineness, and participated in a cultural life that included festivals and ceremonies. They were literate in the sense of being able to read quipus, or at least understand the information encoded in them. Their children might be educated in specialized knowledge, learning crafts or administrative skills that would allow them to maintain or improve their families' positions. The common people who formed the bulk of the population lived simpler lives, focused on agricultural labor or fishing, on meeting tribute obligations and maintaining the infrastructure of irrigation and communication. They did not go hungry in normal times, as the agricultural system produced sufficient surplus to feed everyone, but they had little beyond necessities. Their homes were modest, their possessions few, their daily lives consumed by work. Yet they participated in the larger culture of the kingdom, attending festivals and ceremonies, sharing in the religious life that permeated society, and taking pride in being part of a powerful and successful civilization. The military strength that had built the empire and that continued to defend it remained formidable. Chimu warriors were well-equipped and experienced, drawn from various parts of the kingdom and organized into forces capable of sustained campaigns. The logistical systems that supplied armies on the march had been refined through generations of warfare, allowing Chimu forces to operate far from their bases. The coastal geography gave them advantages in some contexts, as naval mobility allowed forces to move quickly and to strike at locations that land-based opponents could not easily defend. The fortifications that protected key locations were substantial, built from adobe and stone and garrisoned by loyal troops. Yet the very size of the empire created vulnerabilities. The vast distances between the northern and southern frontiers made rapid response to threats difficult. The need to garrison multiple regions dispersed military forces across the kingdom. Subject populations in distant valleys might harbor resentments and require monitoring to prevent rebellion. The administrative burden of managing so much territory strained even the sophisticated bureaucratic systems the Chimu had developed. Maintaining the irrigation infrastructure across dozens of valleys required constant attention and substantial labor. The flow of tribute had to be organized and enforced, with officials traveling regularly to ensure compliance. The wealth and power of Chan Chan made it a target for envy and ambition. In the highlands to the east, other powers were rising, consolidating their own territories and building their own empires. The Chimu were aware of these highland developments, but may not have fully appreciated the threat they represented. The coast had always been culturally and politically distinct from the mountains, and coastal powers had rarely faced serious challenges from highland states. The Wari had extended influence over some coastal areas centuries earlier, but that empire had collapsed, and its coastal presence had been ephemeral. There seemed little reason to fear that history would not repeat itself, that the coast would remain supreme in its own domain. The early 15th century thus represented a moment of culmination for the Chimu Kingdom. Everything that generations of rulers had worked to build had reached fruition. The territory was at its maximum extent. The tribute system functioned smoothly. The capital was magnificent. The arts and crafts flourished. The population was large and mostly prosperous. The military was strong. The administrative systems were sophisticated and effective. The Kingdom of Gold stood at the height of its power, controlling the coast from desert to desert, from valley to valley, its influence reaching far beyond its borders through trade and cultural prestige. It must have seemed that this success was permanent, that the structures so carefully built would endure indefinitely, that Chan Chan would remain the greatest city of the coast for generations to come. Yet even at this moment of triumph, forces were gathering in the distant highlands that would challenge and ultimately destroy Chimu independence, bringing the kingdom under the control of a new imperial power that was just beginning its own dramatic rise to dominance. In the highland valleys surrounding the city of Cusco, far to the southeast of Chan Chan, in a mountainous realm that had developed largely independently of coastal civilization, a new power was emerging that would transform the entire Andean world. The Inca, who had begun as one small kingdom among many competing highland states, embarked on a program of expansion during the early 15th century that rapidly enlarged their territory and brought them into contact with peoples throughout the Andes. Under a succession of ambitious and militarily successful rulers, they conquered their highland neighbors, absorbed regional kingdoms, and began to cast their eyes beyond the mountains toward the wealthy coastal valleys they could see stretching away toward the Pacific. The early phases of Inca expansion focused on consolidating control over the regions immediately surrounding Cusco. The ruler known as Pachacuti, who came to power around 1438, following a crisis in which Cusco was nearly destroyed by enemies, initiated a transformation of Inca society and statecraft that turned a regional kingdom into an expanding empire. He reorganized the military, reformed administrative structures, undertook massive construction projects in Cusco, and launched campaigns of conquest that brought valley after valley under Inca control. His reign marked the beginning of Inca imperial power, the moment when a highland kingdom became a force capable of challenging any state in the Andes. The Inca approach to empire building combined military might with sophisticated strategies of incorporation and control. Conquered peoples were often allowed to maintain their local leaders and customs, provided they accepted Inca overlordship and fulfilled tribute obligations. Resistance was met with devastating force, but cooperation was rewarded with positions in the imperial hierarchy and access to the benefits of inclusion in a large and successful state. The Inca moved populations strategically, relocating communities to serve imperial purposes and break up potentially rebellious groups. They built roads and way stations that facilitated communication and troop movements, creating infrastructure that bound the empire together. For the Chimu, secure in their coastal realm, the rise of this highland power may initially have seemed of little concern. The coast and the highlands were different worlds, separated by geography and by centuries of distinct cultural development. Highland states had occasionally influenced coastal affairs in the past, but they had never successfully conquered and held the coastal valleys for extended periods. The Chimu controlled the irrigation systems that were the foundations of coastal life, possessed wealth accumulated over generations, and commanded military forces with their own traditions and strength. There seemed little reason to fear highlanders who knew nothing of managing desert agriculture or of the maritime resources that enriched the coast. Yet the Inca were unlike previous highland powers in their ambition, organization, and military capabilities. As they expanded their territory through the southern and central highlands, they inevitably came closer to the sphere of Chimu influence. The highland valleys that drained westward toward the coast became points of contact between the two empires. Trade routes that connected coast and mountains suddenly took on strategic significance as potential invasion routes. The buffer zones of independent or loosely affiliated territories that had separated the two powers began to disappear as both states expanded toward each other. The first direct conflicts between Chimu and Inca forces probably occurred in the borderlands between their respective territories, skirmishes and raids rather than major campaigns. Local rulers who found themselves caught between two expanding empires had to choose sides or attempt to maintain neutrality that was increasingly untenable. Some highland valleys that had traded peacefully with the coast found themselves incorporated into the Inca Empire and forbidden from independent contact with coastal states. Coastal valleys that had enjoyed autonomy or that had been only loosely controlled by Chan were pressured to declare clearly their allegiance to one power or the other. The Chimu responded to the growing threat by attempting to strengthen their hold on frontier territories and by fortifying key positions. Defensive works were constructed or reinforced at strategic locations, particularly at the points where routes from the highlands descended to the coast. Garrisons were placed to guard these passes and to provide warning of any major Inca movements toward coastal territories. The military forces of the kingdom were mobilized more frequently, and the tribute system was perhaps pressed harder to provide the resources necessary for sustained military readiness. The ease and prosperity of the early 15th century began to give way to a more anxious atmosphere as the reality of the Inca threat became undeniable. Diplomatic contacts between the two powers may have occurred as both sides attempted to assess the other's intentions and capabilities. Embassies might have traveled between Chan and Cuzco, carrying messages and gifts, engaging in the careful negotiations that often preceded warfare in Andean political culture. The Chimu ruler would have sought to project strength and confidence, to discourage Inca aggression through displays of power and threats of the costs that invasion would entail. The Inca, for their part, may have demanded submission, offering the Chimu the opportunity to join the empire peacefully, with promises of honored positions within the imperial hierarchy if they would acknowledge Inca supremacy. Such diplomatic efforts, if they occurred, ultimately failed to prevent conflict. The fundamental incompatibility between two expanding empires occupying adjacent territories made some form of confrontation nearly inevitable. The Chimu could not accept subordination to a highland power without abandoning everything their kingdom represented, without negating the independence and prestige they had spent generations building. The Inca could not tolerate a powerful independent state on their borders, particularly one that controlled territories and resources they desired for their own empire. The stage was set for a showdown between coastal and highland power, between two of the most successful states that had ever existed in the Andes. The Inca advantages in this impending confrontation were significant, though perhaps not fully appreciated by the Chimu leadership. The highland empire had larger population from which to draw warriors, their territory encompassing more valleys and regions than the Chimu controlled. The Inca military had been forged in constant warfare against numerous opponents, gaining experience and developing tactics through repeated campaigns. The organizational capabilities of the Inca state were formidable, able to mobilize and sustain large armies in the field for extended periods. The highland location gave them the advantage of descending to the coast, with gravity assisting their movements, while any Chimu counteroffensive into the mountains would face the exhausting challenge of fighting at high altitude. The Chimu had their own strengths, however, that gave them reason for confidence. They possessed immense wealth accumulated through generations of prosperity, resources that could be mobilized for defense. The irrigation systems that were fundamental to coastal life were under their control, and they understood that destroying or threatening these systems could be used as a defensive strategy, even if it meant temporary hardship for their own people. The coastal geography, with its string of isolated valleys separated by desert stretches, favored defense, as each valley could potentially be held as a strong point. The maritime capabilities of coastal peoples gave them mobility that highland forces lacked, potentially allowing them to reinforce threatened points or strike at unexpected locations. As tensions escalated, life within the Chimu Kingdom began to change in ways that reflected the growing sense of threat. The construction projects that had characterized earlier periods may have slowed as resources were diverted to military preparations. The tribute demands on subject populations likely increased, causing resentment and hardship in outlying territories. The borders of the empire became militarized zones where normal life was disrupted by the presence of troops and the constant state of alert. Refugees from border regions that fell under Inca attack or control fled toward the coastal heartland, bringing stories of highland military prowess that may have spread fear among the population. The fortifications that the Chimu constructed or strengthened reveal their defensive strategy and their understanding of the threat they faced. Stone walls were built across valley necks and at strategic passes, positions that could be defended by relatively small forces against larger attacking armies. Hilltop fortresses provided refuges and observation posts, places from which approaching forces could be spotted and from which resistance could be organized. The locations of these defensive works show that the Chimu understood the likely routes of Inca advance and attempted to block or delay movement along those routes. The scale of fortification represents a major mobilization of labor and resources, evidence of how seriously the threat was taken. Within Chan Chan itself, there may have been debates about strategy and policy. Some advisors might have counseled accommodation, arguing that peaceful submission to Inca authority would preserve much of what made Chimu civilization valuable while avoiding the destruction that warfare would bring. Others would have advocated resistance to the end, arguing that independence was worth any cost and that the Chimu had the resources and determination to successfully defend their kingdom. The ruler had to balance these perspectives while also managing the practical challenges of preparing for war, maintaining the support of nobility and commoners alike, and keeping the administrative and economic systems of the kingdom functioning under increasing strain. The psychological dimension of the conflict should not be underestimated. For generations, the Chimu had been the dominant power on the coast, the most successful and powerful state in their world. The rise of a highland threat challenged their sense of superiority and security. The coastal peoples had long seen themselves as more sophisticated and civilized than mountain dwellers, their cities grander, their arts more refined, their wealth greater. To be threatened with conquest by highlanders was not just a political and military challenge, but a cultural affront that struck at the heart of coastal identity. This may have stiffened resistance, making it difficult to contemplate submission even when pragmatic considerations might have suggested accommodation. The religious dimensions of the conflict also mattered. The Chimu worshipped the moon and the sea, deities that had protected and blessed their civilization for centuries. The Inca revered the sun and emphasized highland huacas and sacred sites. How could the moon god allow his people to be conquered by sun worshippers? What did it mean for cosmic order if the sacred forces that had sustained the kingdom failed to protect it? These religious questions added another layer of complexity to the crisis, as priests and rulers struggled to interpret events and maintain confidence in divine protection, even as the threat grew more immediate and dangerous. As the 1460s progressed, the situation continued to deteriorate for the Chimu. Inca forces were pushing closer to the core coastal territories, conquering or intimidating populations in the frontier zones. The northern and southern extremes of Chimu territory were most vulnerable, farthest from the capital and hardest to defend or reinforce. Local lords in these distant regions faced difficult choices, weighing loyalty to Chan Chan against the immediate presence of Inca armies and the apparent momentum of highland conquest. Some may have begun to waver in their allegiance, calculating that accommodation with the Inca offered better prospects than continued resistance. The final major Inca campaign against the Chimu Kingdom would be led by Tupac Yupanqui, son of Pachacuti, and one of the most capable military commanders in Inca history. He had proven himself in numerous highland campaigns and had been entrusted with expanding the empire northward. The conquest of the wealthy coastal kingdom would be his greatest achievement, a campaign that would require not just military skill, but strategic understanding of how to defeat an enemy that could not be approached through conventional highland warfare alone. The stage was set for the final confrontation, a clash between coastal and highland power that would determine the fate of the Kingdom of Gold and reshape the political landscape of the entire Andean region. The campaign that Tupac Yupanqui launched against the Chimu Kingdom sometime around 1470 was executed with a strategic sophistication that revealed Inca understanding of coastal vulnerabilities. Rather than simply attempting to fight his way down the valleys from the highlands, Tupac employed a strategy that struck at the foundation of coastal power itself. The rivers that descended from the Andes to irrigate the coastal fields all originated in highland territory, and the Inca forces moved to control these water sources. By threatening to divert or dam the rivers, they could hold entire coastal populations hostage without necessarily fighting major battles. The choice presented to the Chimu was stark: submit or watch their fields turn to dust and their people starve. This strategy demonstrated remarkable insight into what made coastal civilization possible. All the wealth and power of Chan Chan, all the sophisticated irrigation infrastructure, all the centuries of engineering achievement, ultimately depended on water that came from beyond Chimu control. The highland location of the Inca gave them leverage that no coastal rival had ever possessed. Previous conflicts between coastal states had been fought over control of valleys and canals, but both sides had equal access to the river sources. Now the Chimu faced an enemy who could cut off the water itself, making their engineering skills and defensive fortifications largely irrelevant if the rivers stopped flowing. The Chimu leadership must have recognized the desperation of their situation. They could attempt to fight, but without water, their population could not survive more than a brief period. They could try to negotiate, but the Inca were demanding complete submission, the incorporation of the kingdom into their empire with all that implied for loss of independence. Some resistance was certainly offered, as Inca accounts of the campaign mention battles and the reduction of fortified positions. Chimu warriors fought to defend their homeland, but the strategic situation was untenable. The noose was tightening, and no amount of bravery in battle could overcome the fundamental vulnerability of depending on water sources controlled by the enemy. The end came not with a climactic battle, but with negotiations and submission. The Chimu ruler, whose name is recorded in some sources as Minchantuman, travelled to meet with Tupac Yupanqui, acknowledging defeat and accepting incorporation into the Inca Empire. The terms of surrender allowed for some preservation of Chimu elite status within the new imperial order, but the independence of the kingdom was finished. Chan Chan would no longer be the capital of an independent state, but a provincial city within the vast Inca realm. The rulers who had governed from the great ciudadelas, who had commanded armies and administered an empire of their own, now became subordinate lords serving Inca masters. Tupac Yupanqui entered Chan Chan as conqueror, and his forces took control of the city and the surrounding territories. The wealth accumulated over centuries was assessed, and much of it was appropriated for the Inca Empire. Gold and silver, textiles and precious objects were gathered and sent to Cuzco to enrich the highland capital and glorify the Inca ruler. The quipus that recorded the resources of the kingdom were read by Inca administrators who assumed control of the tribute system and redirected its flow toward imperial purposes. The irrigation systems that had sustained coastal prosperity were maintained and even improved under Inca direction, but now they served the broader interests of an empire centered far away in the mountains. The fate of the Chimu nobility was complex and varied. Minchancaman was reportedly taken to Cuzco, where he was kept as both honored guest and hostage, a symbol of Inca power over the defeated kingdom. His presence in the highland capital ensured that the coastal territories would remain compliant, as any rebellion might result in harm to their former ruler. Other members of the Chimu elite were incorporated into the Inca administrative hierarchy, given positions that allowed them to maintain some status and authority while serving the new masters. The most skilled artisans, particularly the metalworkers whose expertise was renowned throughout the Andes, were also taken to Cuzco, where they worked for Inca patrons and taught their techniques to highland craftspeople. This transfer of Chimu goldsmiths and silversmiths to the highland capital had lasting effects on Inca art and culture. The technical sophistication of coastal metallurgy influenced highland traditions, contributing to a synthesis of styles and techniques that characterized late Inca artistic production. Objects created for Inca rulers incorporated coastal methods and aesthetic sensibilities, blending highland and coastal traditions into new forms. The cultural influence flowed in both directions, as Inca styles and iconography also spread to the coast, creating the artistic hybridity that characterized the final pre-Hispanic decades in the Andes. For the common people of the former Chimu Kingdom, the conquest meant changes in administration and tribute obligations, but perhaps less dramatic disruption to daily life. They continued to farm the same fields, fish the same ocean, work in the same workshops. The canals still needed maintenance, the crops still needed tending, the rhythms of agricultural life continued much as they had before. The tribute they paid now flowed to Inca storehouses rather than Chimu ciudadelas, but the essential pattern of their existence remained similar. The great transformation was political rather than economic or social for most of the population, a change of masters rather than a fundamental restructuring of how life was lived. Chan Chan itself began a slow decline after the conquest. The city remained inhabited and important, but it was no longer the center of power and culture it had been. No new ciudadelas were built, as the rulers who might have constructed them were now subject to Cuzco, rather than independent kings requiring their own palaces and eventual tombs. The population may have decreased as some inhabitants moved to other centers or were relocated by Inca administrators. The maintenance of the massive adobe structures required constant attention in the coastal environment, and without the resources and will that had sustained them during the kingdom's independence, some areas began to deteriorate. The city that had been the greatest on the coast was entering its twilight, still impressive, but no longer the vital center it had once been. The Inca ruled the coast for less than a century before they themselves faced conquest by an even more distant power. When Spanish conquistadors arrived in Peru in the early 1530s, they found an empire in crisis, racked by civil war and recently devastated by European diseases that had spread ahead of actual European presence. The Inca Empire, so recently dominant and seemingly invincible, fell with shocking speed to a small force of Spanish adventurers whose technology and tactics, combined with indigenous allies and epidemic disease, overwhelmed the highland state. The Spanish conquest brought an end not just to Inca rule, but to the entire tradition of independent Andean civilization. For Chan Chan and the descendants of the Chimu people, the Spanish conquest meant new masters and new disruptions. The Spanish were interested primarily in extracting precious metals to send to Spain, and they quickly assessed the wealth that remained on the coast. Much of what the Inca had not already taken was now seized by the conquistadors, melted down, and shipped across the Atlantic. The great adobe city, already declining, was largely abandoned as Spanish colonial authorities established new administrative centers, and as the indigenous population, devastated by disease and exploitation, plummeted in numbers. The fields that had fed tens of thousands fell into disuse as there were no longer people to tend them or irrigation systems to maintain them. The physical remains of Chan Chan slowly deteriorated under the effects of time and occasional El Niño rains that damaged the adobe structures. Sand drifted over parts of the site, burying portions while leaving others exposed to erosion. Treasure hunters periodically dug into the ruins, seeking gold and silver that might have been overlooked, damaging archaeological context and destroying information about the past. The knowledge of what the city had been, of the kingdom it had ruled, faded from memory outside of fragmentary references in Spanish chronicles and oral traditions that preserved scraps of information across generations. The modern rediscovery of Chimu civilization began in the 19th and early 20th centuries as scholars and explorers became interested in the pre-Hispanic past of Peru. The ruins of Chan Chan, visible and impressive even in decay, attracted attention as one of the most significant archaeological sites in South America. Early investigations documented the layout of the ciudadelas and began to understand the organization of the city. Excavations uncovered the wealth of grave goods that had been buried with Chimu nobility, revealing the artistic sophistication and technical skill of coastal craftspeople. Museums began to display Chimu metalwork and ceramics, introducing the world to an ancient civilization that had been largely forgotten. Archaeological work has continued through the 20th and into the 21st century, with increasingly sophisticated methods revealing more about Chimu society, economy, politics, and culture. The study of settlement patterns across the coastal valleys has illuminated how the kingdom organized its territory. Analysis of skeletal remains has provided information about health, diet, and the lives of ordinary people. Examination of irrigation systems has documented the engineering achievements that made desert civilization possible. Conservation efforts have worked to preserve what remains of Chan Chan and other sites, protecting them from further deterioration and from the expansion of modern cities that threatens many coastal archaeological sites. The legacy of the Chimu extends beyond archaeological sites and museum collections. The irrigation techniques they refined continue to influence water management in the coastal desert. With some ancient canals still visible in the landscape, and occasionally still in use. The artistic traditions they developed contributed to a broader Andean aesthetic that influenced later artistic production and that continues to inspire contemporary artists. The very fact that a sophisticated urban civilization could be built and sustained in one of the driest deserts on Earth stands as testament to human ingenuity and organizational capacity, a reminder that challenging environments can be transformed through knowledge and collective effort. In the villages and towns of the North Coast, descendants of the people who built the Kingdom of Gold maintain connections to that ancient past, however attenuated by centuries of colonial rule and cultural disruption. Elements of pre-Hispanic culture persist in language, in place names, in agricultural practices, in folk traditions that preserve memories of times before the Spanish came. The coast retains its own distinct identity within Peru, a regional consciousness that draws partly on pride in the achievements of ancient coastal civilizations, including the Chimu. The relationship between past and present is complex, neither simple continuity nor complete rupture, but a layered history where ancient achievements continue to resonate in the modern world. The Kingdom of Gold, in its centuries of existence, demonstrated that the desert coast of Peru could support one of the great civilizations of the ancient Americas. Through sophisticated water management, artistic brilliance, political organization, and economic innovation, the Chimu created an urban culture that rivaled anything being built elsewhere in the hemisphere. Their adobe cities, their golden treasures, their engineered landscapes, and their social achievements stand as testament to what was possible in the Andean world before European contact. The story of their rise and fall, their centuries of glory, and their eventual subjugation forms a chapter in human history that reveals both the possibilities and the limits of ancient statecraft. In the silence of the ruined ciudadelas, and in the artifacts preserved in museums, in the irrigation ditches still visible in the sand, and in the memories preserved by descendants, the Kingdom of Gold endures as testament to the civilization that once flourished, where the desert meets the sea.